and reports and chapters examining sustainable livelihoods and how communities are changing the future by developing regionally relevant solutions. Stephen is also a board member of Magbala Books, a board member of the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and was recently the chairperson of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra. And is also on the curatorial team of the new museum in Perth.
I was, I'm out of a job.
Oh, okay. So I'd like you to welcome...
If anyone's got any curatorial...
So I'd like you to welcome Stephen to the podium.
Okay, well, that sounds all very serious. Let's hope that the discussion today isn't so serious. Firstly, an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the Southern Yamatji traditional owners of the country we're meeting on today, the Nunagari, Wilanyu, Amangu, Naguja and Widi peoples, to celebrate writing, story and community as part of the Big Sky Writers Festival. I'd also like to thank the organisers, sponsors and community of Geraldton for inviting us all to participate and creating a space for us to meet and share stories in these difficult times. It's okay, that's happened to me. Please don't rush, it's all right. So I don't want to speak for the whole time, but when we were working this out, Trudy and I was originally just going to speak to some key points and some images and tell stories, which is kind of what I prefer to do. But she said, no, it's meant to be a formal paper. So I will deliver a formal paper. So I would normally take questions while I'm talking. We won't because we need to do this, but I've tried to make it a little bit literary, but we'll see how we go. So, being a literary festival, I felt I should begin with a prologue to set the scene. Standing amidst the hum of traffic, ghost memories rise up to meet us. They carry us along before I begin, actually, I should explain that the images you're seeing were the images I was going to talk to, but I thought that we should still roll them so that you can have a look at the images while I'm talking, so you get a sense of some of the history. And also, these are basically images from the biscuit tin, so to speak. We've all got family photos in the biscuit tin, and these are mine, or my family's, and largely, sent by people and about our family's history. So I'll continue. Let's start again. Standing amidst the hum of traffic, ghost memories rise up to meet us. They carry us along former creeks and rivulets, through paperbark forests and well-worn tracks, dissected by gridded streets and crafted canyons of concrete, steel and glass. They float between the weight of our contested collective histories and the watery underground streams of our hopes and dreams. Unformed, layered fragments of our lived and imagined past resonate across the generations, tickling an ear, brushing an eyelash, creating an ancestral hum all their own, stilling us momentarily, hopefully, in a spirit of place. Drawn to the light, ghost memories break ground, cross time, ride the wind, hold us to account, uplift us, unsteady us. They challenge us to rise to our fleeting time, to recognise our humanity, to be present, to be open to possibility, to be generous to the future, even in the face of great uncertainty. The note that I'm reaching for and hope to hit as I speak to you today is one of recognition and respect for our differences, but also respect for the resonances of narrative that connect us to each other and to place. In considering what rises to the light, I want to reflect on having been part of the making and sharing of story binding people in place since the 1980s, and also to place the power of their making in the context of our uncertain times. I've had the fortune to write books and chapters, make films, curate exhibitions, document culture on country, be part of a movement of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal writers and researchers working collaboratively against the tide of forgetting that gripped our nation and still resonates with some of its colonial foundations. This work involved writing literary non-fiction, researching archives, but mostly, and most importantly, it involved interviewing dozens of community members' accounts of their histories, their personal lives, bound to country, to shared experience of removal from country, and intangible cultural heritage of language, song and culture. This work has also involved investigating more immediate contemporary issues of relevance to our communities, caring for country, cultural governance, transitions through education, impacts of alcohol, youth diversionary programs and stolen wages as some examples. More recently, I've been part of curatorial teams working collaboratively to share stories as a part of the reimagining of the new museum in WA, in Perth, particularly focused on the Kimberley region. This front of work is a small part of a now decades-long movement of changing the narrative, but it has not been without its pushback, as with the history wars and attempts to reignite culture wars. The need to stop and take stock has become a common theme of modern human experience. As different parts of the world have been impacted severely by COVID-19, we in WA have been very fortunate. Yet, I remember the anxiety that swept the nation, WA, and especially remote Aboriginal communities in places such as the Kimberley, when COVID-19 first appeared. I found myself part of some community responses in need to isolate our old people, our living libraries in the East Kimberley, and informing national responses to the lockdown in the form of funding for the collection of oral histories in situ as an emergency response. With the rise of that threat, we reached for what was most precious, our families, and also sought to protect our memory, culture and history in the form of our old people. At a time when we are bombarded with information and assaulted by polarised positioning and manipulation of fact, I want to consider how respecting the power of story and of being present in our time and able to stand still and reflect is so important. I want to consider how this can enable us to achieve what historian Tim Rouse referred to as an effort of historical imagination, to feel the sense of the historical moment that we are in by respecting the layers of history that underpin our time. I hope to shed light on the power of voice that has arisen from memory, culture and belonging. I also want to take you on a quick journey across the historical context, informing the making of these works and giving voice to our experience. Time does not allow for a detailed reckoning, but rather, I want to set a note of reflection on resonance of historical narratives, oral memory, and the cyclical nature of historical retelling as each generation approaches these stories and their own sense of connection to place. To do so, I want to open up a few sites of ghost memories across my own life and work, to stand still and listen to what we can sense of the stories that rise to the light. I am a Mara from Wirrawong country. Mara is a Yinjibarndi term, blood, that describes people like myself who are Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal ancestry. Growing up, it was a common term used in my community of Norwesters, that is, Aboriginal people whose family had been taken from their country in the north and raised in missions and settlements in the south. It was preferable to such terms as half-caste or part Aboriginal because it spoke to our belonging to all of our ancestors and was also Aboriginal owned. Even though it was a Yinjibarndi term from the Pilbara, it has taken hold and spread across the state, but seems less common nowadays with younger generations. Nan, Mrs. Alice Nana, who was referred to earlier, proudly referred to herself as a Mara, being Yinjibarndi, but also because she was an inmate of the dreaded Mooriva native settlement just a few hours' drive south of Gelton, where this language term took hold. Mooriva was a place of incredible intersection of knowledge, language, story and interconnection, not by people's choice to be there, but by people's choice to survive it. I spent many weeks in Geraldton in the late 1980s and early 1990s, working with Nan and co-author the Lauren Marsh with Nan on the story of her life, When the Pelican Laughed. Nan was a consummate storyteller, a raconteur, a woman of high degree. Sadly, the last time I spoke in Geraldton in any formal sense was at Nan's funeral, at the request of her family, just over 25 years ago now. It was an honour to be part of the sharing of her story and those many peoples whose lives she crossed, as it's been an honour to be reminded of her beautiful voice and incredible strength in the face of diversity in the way that story was received. I'd like to share something of Nan's voice with you now from an event that took place here to open up a ghost memory of Geraldton at the old Radio Picture Theatres, 1950. Nan had brought her children to town to attend the Saturday matinee, a Tom Mix Western. We'd all go in, sit down, try and enjoy ourselves. But there are a few white kids in town who are really terrible. They turn around and poke their tongues out or sling off at us with nigger nigger, pull the trigger, bang bang, you're dead. These boys continued this through the film, and they put chewing gum on Nan's son's seat as a joke, damaging hard-earned good clothing that she'd scraped to buy. before the pictures finished, Nan went outside to the narrow exit and blocked it, baby on hip, and faced the crowd. Everyone just stood there and looked at me, and there were quite a few of them too. The foyer was full. "Look," I said, "I've been coming down here every Saturday afternoon bringing my children to enjoy the matinee, just like you people. And what do we get? Nigger, nigger, boom, boom, pull the trigger, this, that and the other. Well, I've had it. I want you people to try and understand how that feels. Why don't you bring your children up? Don't drag them up. It's a disgrace." As policemen began to attend, Nan continued addressing the crowd about how to raise children properly, challenging anyone to come up and take blood from her and blood from them and swirl it around in a saucer while blindfolded and have them identified which is different. "And I'll be back next week, don't you worry about that. And I want to be treated as such, no names called. Furthermore, if any of you can defend yourselves, come out here and tell me if I'm wrong. You come out here and tell me." But they didn't tell me. They just stood there. "Right," I said. "You haven't got anything to say? You can go." And I just stepped aside. Nan was all too aware of the power of words and the need for truth-telling. It was part of what drove her and us to want to record and document her history and the history of dozens of others, of women like Nan, removed from their country, raised to be servants, but rising to be so much more than the role that society or their time had sought to lock them into. Nan's memories were precious to her, and those memories would not be silenced. Within our communities, we all know the power of our oral stories to sustain us, but so too do these stories been silenced, making acts like Nan's some 70 years ago all the more remarkable. Had Nan not been able to share that story with us, perhaps this story would have become a ghost memory that someone would sense somehow, perhaps resurrect, perhaps another witness. What seems normal now in rich shared oral testimony was not the case in Nan's early life, or even when we first began recording her story in the late 1980s. Growing up, our own Aboriginal histories were largely ignored, marginalised, bookmarked in the beginning of mainstream histories. Even so, these memories persisted in the lived realities of our people and in the archives that remained unchallenged by our own experience and interpretation. This was until the staid models of Australian history began to be reinterpreted through oral testimony, and as we researchers, informed by the power of these voices, began to reinvestigate the archives, unveiling rich narratives and counter-narratives. Laurie Bamblett, writing of his people's history at the Urambi Mission in Cowra, in Wiradjuri country, speaks of how oral stories of survival are central to the continuity of Wiradjuri culture. He says, "It is both a celebration of the survival of Wiradjuri storytelling tradition and a call to rethink the way that stories about Aboriginal people are told." Laurie cautions those approaching contested histories that it is not only necessary to consider the reader's own position, but in reading the evidence that has been created within the loaded space of all things Indigenous in Australia. He says, "Non-Indigenous peoples consistently emphasise difference and inferiority on the part of Aboriginal people. The reader should not only consider what is known about Indigenous communities, but also where that knowledge comes from." Until the late 1960s and 1970s, a range of common narratives were constructed, framed in legislation founded in race-based ideologies and ingrown notions of superiority. These common narratives proved all-pervasive and dangerously impacting for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. Their overt and largely accepted power would be challenged by Indigenous leadership and agency born within and aimed at responding directly to these imposed laws, social norms and narratives of constructed things, not of our choosing. Australian history has matured significantly from the days of the cult of forgetfulness, marked by failure of any real engagement with, quote, unacknowledged relations between the two racial groups, as identified by W.E.H. Stanner in the second of his 1968 Boyer lecture series, The Great Australian Silence. This was in spite of the fact that early colonists left a lively account, both amicable and violent, exploitative but also of humanitarian relations, and public debates about Aboriginal people in the newspapers, personal memoirs, professional historians, and also in journals, as authors such as Bruce Pascoe create debate, which we can talk about later. From an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective, the continent was made up of separate countries, linked through cultural governance of groups who shared law, language, ritual, resources, trade. Within the lands and waters of the Meriam, the Wiradjuri, Gadigal, Aranda, Noongar, Yaru, Yamaji, Kuki Yalanji, Mirawang, to name a few of the 250 separate language groups, these constructions would take more than 2 centuries to overturn, legally, through the Marlborough High Court judgment. Yet the myth of terra nullius that underpinned those notions of discovery and European superiority remained in unformed imaginings in popular culture. Not so much ghost memories, but clearly labelled statements. Regardless of the thousands of oral histories that have been shared alongside more mature engagement with the archival record in Australia, the question of possession of what came to be known as Australia, or its polemic counterpart, dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owners, remains a long-standing debate within our country. Within these polls, my late friend historian Penny Taylor related how these cyclical narratives have a long history. I can hear Penny's voice. She's passed away in January, sadly. Australian history books up until the 1970s rarely mentioned Aboriginal people. Instead, they featured colonial heroes, explorers, intrepid pioneers, conquest of the interior and spread of civilisation. Most school books in the first half of the 20th century devoted far more space to merino sheep than to Aboriginal people. If Indigenous Australians were mentioned at all, they were represented as killing the occasional shepherd before fading away before the forces of progress. Stanner's landmark Boyer lecture of 1968 was both a turning point and a reflection on the changing mood of the maturing nation state. Coming on the heels of the 1967 referendum, it was voiced close to the flame of decades of Aboriginal political and social agitation aimed at transforming the Australian nation state and its people. Beyond these political movements, which were important manifestations of people's rights, sense of belonging and identity, so did the 1970s begin to reclaim Aboriginal narrative of personal storytelling. But it was not really until the 1980s and 1990s that Aboriginal voices began to rise up, interrogating the archives. Over time, models of Australian history have been subject to reinterpretation and reinvestigation. Change can be seen as a series of shifts in perspective. The reinterpretation of evidence within changing cultural attitudes of those framing the question that guided original investigations. Historians cannot be devoid from their cultural foundations, and neither can they be expected to have access to every piece of evidence. Evidence does not make itself known, as my mum would say when I was looking for socks. What do you expect it to do, jump up and say, here I am? New evidence is emerging all the time, as a vast store of records kept about Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander peoples is used to inform reinterpretations of the past. Professor Anna Haybick has written extensively on historical issues of national significance. In particular, she researched Aboriginal history using a wide range of sources, mainly including oral testimony. Summing up the battleground of Australian history, Anna noted that the debate during the 1970s to the 21st century were ones where proponents have fought to replace national myths of benign settlement and unimpeded progress with discomforting histories of colonial invasion and destruction driven by demand for land and resources at any cost. These counter-histories have played a central role in national debates over native title, sovereignty, Aboriginal deaths in custody, Mabo, stolen generations and more recently stolen wages. In terms of deaths in custody, I've just attended a funeral just a few weeks ago, a young man who passed away in Perth. And so these things are always with us. Professor Marcia Langton, a Wiradjuri Witjara woman, also recognised the shift from having the bizarre yet common experience of being Aboriginal and being taught histories in school that almost invariably overlooked any sense of Aboriginal understanding of the past, to eventually arriving in a situation where new generations of historians have uncovered different understandings. She says, the ridiculous, the audacious, as well as the common garden variety activities of ordinary and extraordinary people, these have replaced the monotonous tales of the march of civilisation. In regard to the way in which generalised debates and studies of movement in history can move the personal and connecting nature of our histories, Penny Taylor reminds us, the shared past of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians may well be harrowing and confronting, but but it also contains actions of great courage and humanity by individuals from various backgrounds, lasting relationships of warmth, loyalty and affection, and ordinary people of goodwill. Within a similarly considered perspective, Marcia Langton acknowledges the approach of Australian history more generally, that it's maturing. History, she says, is a world of alternatives. Readers of the archives will each follow their own trail through the pages of journals, diaries, past accounts and images, perhaps lured by a special character or intrigued by a particular event. When we are able to approach history in this way, considering a range of evidence, interpreting the perspectives of witnesses, acknowledging the context of the period of evidence making, and importantly reflecting on our own positions within this analysis, history continues to provide us with new understandings of our present. As my friend Penny Taylor reminds us, we should not be afraid of debates or divergent perspectives of the past. Acknowledge that different generations will enter the same labyrinth, revisit available evidence, weigh up new evidence and redress their past as a means of living with their present. No one has a monopoly on the truth, and often the only way to advance knowledge is to suggest interpretations beyond the currently perceived truths or wisdoms. This is the historian's craft, and with greater frequency and diversity since the 1970s, thanks in part to Stannis Boyer lecture series of 1968, non-Indigenous historians initially and later, increasingly, Indigenous historians and writers have created rich narratives and counter-narratives. We've got good time going on. So I want to take you to a moment in time when I was 20. In 1988, at the age of 20, I travelled with thousands of other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to Sydney as a part of the Long March of people gathering to protest the bicentenary's landing of the first fleet in Gadigal country, Sydney. Established on the banks of Sydney Harbour, the week leading up to the event near Mrs Macquarie's chair, the tent embassy was led by Koori community leaders to make a statement of sovereignty, that their lands and territories were never ceded by treaty or conquest, and that then, 1988, the doctrine of terra nullius was nothing but myth. By day, police came and went. Journalists from all over the world held interviews with the harbour and Aboriginal flag in the backdrop. Indigenous leaders from all over Australia visited and shared a sense of common purpose to reinforce the land rights movement, make visible what was being attempted to be made invisible, and declare, "We have survived. This is Aboriginal land," or to ask, "Captain who?" In regard to Captain Cook, a reference to my t-shirt of that time. We felt we were a part of history, and in particular a part of a long lineage of counter-narratives to the history that was about to be played out before us on Sydney Harbour on 26th of January 1988, as Prince Charles and Princess Diana, bless her, waited at the Opera House to greet an arriving flotilla of tall ships marking reenactment of the landing of the First Fleet. On that day, a group known as Paddlers for Peace joined the embassy with half a dozen kayaks ready to take a paddle out to meet the tall ships in protest. They usually did this for nuclear warships visiting Sydney as protest. They were short of a few people who could not make it down, as more than 3 million people had lined Sydney Harbour for the celebrations. A call went out to see who could paddle a kayak, and before I knew it, I was wearing an Aboriginal flag pinned to my back and chest and paddling out to the parade of sail amid a flotilla of expensive Sydney rivercraft. For some reason, the police boat that arrived seemed intent on corralling us, Paddlers for Peace, into the path of the oncoming tall ship that was making its way via television towards Princess Diana and the Opera House. 2 of my fellow paddlers were arrested, but I was able to use the ship's hull like a dolphin, ducking back and forth close to the hull for the police to get in. When I finally broke free and darted between the pleasure craft, the land rights flag became an excellent target for wealthy boating types, who all seemed like refugees from a Wham video, wearing white shorts with white tops, white or yellow cardigans around their necks, as they swore through full beer cans, many connecting. Dragging my kayak up on the shore of the harbour at the side of the tent embassy as F-111 warplanes flew overhead, I hopped on my bike and I headed down to Hyde Park, where 40,000 people gathered for an alternative to the strange events of the reenactment. There, huddled and wet among the largest protests seen in Sydney since the Vietnam moratoriums, I listened as legendary Koori activist Gary Foley addressed the crowd, one of the original tent embassy protesters from 1972. He said, "Let's hope Bob Hawke and this government gets the message loud and clear from all these people here today. It's so magnificent to see black and white Australians together in harmony. This is what Australia could and should be like." It was an inspirational moment, a significant historical event taking place alongside the bicentenary. But for Indigenous leaders of that day and for the thousands who returned to their communities, the hope of the bicentenary protest faded in the face of changing political landscape, in which self-determination would face even greater challenges. Running concurrently with these common and imposed narratives, Aboriginal people began the collective effort that was also influenced through active responses to these systems. Readers of history must address, through the use of multiple narratives, Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives on the power of recognition and the complexity of diversity of Indigenous realities. Protest, or different Aboriginal narratives at that time, which they became, included things like the 1963 Yirrkala Bark Petition, the 10 Embassy in 72, Nookambah dispute in the Kimberley in 1978, 1988 Bicentenary, 1992 the Mabo case, 1997 occupation of Old Parliament House, the 1998 Barunga Statement, 2000 the Reconciliation Marches, the late noughties, the Recognise campaign, and finally, and I'll make comment on the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017. I want to take you to another little ghost memory. Walking north up Mowat Street towards High Street in Fremantle, I remember looking up to see 46 giant black and white images, 2 stories high, of young Indigenous and non-Indigenous students from different universities asking us to recognise this. Largely open-faced, some cheeky, some defiant, all engaging, these students allowed their faces to be projected on the wall and on the web in support of Recognise This, a youth program of the National Recognise campaign that sought to follow up the unfinished business of the 1967 referendum. It was primarily concerned with making further changes through amendments to the Constitution to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as Australia's First Peoples, the removal of constitutional clauses that retain the possibility of discrimination based on race, and retention of the power of governments to legislate for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Recognise This students were joining in the spirit of 1967's successful Yes campaign, and perhaps their grandparents or even great-grandparents participated in it, or at least voted against it. For or against it, I should say. Speaking of the campaign, the then Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner Mick Gooder said more than 222,000 Australians had signed up for the official Recognise campaign. And yet despite all of that commitments, consultation, expert opinions, polling and campaigning, we were no closer to a referendum then than he was when he was first elected to the role in 2010. Then Prime Minister Tony Abbott committed to a referendum in 2013. That's 7 years ago now. Importantly, there has been significant questioning of the Recognise campaign from within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. History has a way of being cyclical and cumulative. As each generation is schooled about its past, parents, teachers, peers and the media, with each telling, we become part of that wheel of history. In its early days to know whether the symbolism inherent in the Recognise campaign will yield significant benefits for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Like all moments in history, people have to act. Someone has to get into a canoe and paddle out to a boat, risk arrest in protest, or sit on the shore and just enjoy the show. We each have our choices. Join in the debate. As my father used to say, question everything. When the Uluru Statement from the Heart was delivered in May 2017, its reference to truth-telling was central. The Statement from the Heart spoke of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes as the First Nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent lands. It spoke of our laws and customs, of common law from time immemorial, of sovereignty as a spiritual notion that had never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. And in that belief that this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australian nationhood. It acknowledged the dimensions of our crisis in the form of high rates of incarceration and alienation in varying forms, and sought constitutional reforms to empower our people to take a rightful place in our own country, stating that when we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to the country. It sought 2 key openly defined outcomes: the establishment of a First Nations voice in the Constitution, and seeking a Makarrata Commission, a truth-telling commission, a process of agreement-making between First Nations and truth-telling. The first requires constitutional change and the delivery of a successful referendum outcome, while the latter can be enacted without the need for constitutional reform. And as I hope I've shown, truth-telling has been underway now for many decades. Then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull rejected the Uluru Statement with respect to creating a national voice to Parliament on the grounds that it was inconsistent with the fundamental principles of what he saw with regard to Western liberal democracy. Some 5 months after the delivery of the statement, Cabinet voted to reject the proposal on the grounds that it was neither desirable nor capable of winning acceptance. In doing so, it rejected the key recommendation of the Referendum Council that it commissioned to consult widely with Aboriginal representatives. Yolngu leader Gulawai Yunupingu responded to the rejection, stressing the practical reasoning behind the Convention's statement. We have identified the very source of our powerlessness. We have traced the cause of why we failed to close the gap. We have no voice in the decisions that impact on us. We will insist that we have a say in decisions, every policy, every service delivered, and every piece of legislation that affects us. Following Prime Minister Turnbull's demise, the response from the current Prime Minister has been to work with Minister Ken Wyatt through representative assemblies to create a voice to Parliament. This work is soon to be delivered, and again, our old people's voices will hopefully be heard. Hopefully they will rise up again as Nan's voice did in 1950. They may not achieve their goal, but they will not stop speaking from the heart. Since 1967, we've seen 2 distinctive and competing narratives at work, impacting most significantly on Aboriginal communities, but equally on the national narrative for all of us. While many had hoped that the yes vote marked a clearer turning point away from inequality and assimilation, and away from expectations of sameness as an ideal, this older narrative still reasserts itself cyclically in commentary, policy and law. In the same way that the transformations of the 20th century affected our old people, the new century continues to shape us. Through sharing our oral histories, through unveiling our historical and social foundations, and through joining with others in interrogating the written record of our past, our history is also transforming our understanding of our present and helping us to make better decisions for the future. It is our history, both long and recent, that is impacting on the minds of others and opening up the possibilities by which these larger competing narratives can be changed, and our stories rise up from ghost memories and into narrative. Again, I'm going to quote my friend Penny Taylor, because I do miss her very much, who passed away in January. Penny said, "History doesn't feed us, provide us with shelter, or keep us warm at night. It has little practical use, and yet every culture in the world values their history." Returning to historian Tim Rouse's statement on the intangibility of moments in history and connecting it with the idea of ghost memory, Tim said, "A moment in history might be understood as conjecture in which multiple structures, demographic, economic, ideational, technological, institutional, happen to combine in their determinations, generating the occurrences that we narrate as the events of the moment. It takes an effort of historical imagination to see any moment, and particularly the one that we are living through, in the perspective afforded by the sensitivity to the deep historical structures that are shaping that moment. History in this way is cyclical, episodic, transformative, transforming and positioning. It holds us to account and reframes our present. To recognise this moment is to understand what history tells us and how it does so, and how we choose to act with this knowledge. Thank you.
Wonderful, Steve. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing so many personal memories. Your insight and the photographs are just stunning.
Well, I blame you.
I love old photographs.
That's why I've only had 3 hours sleep.
I know. I was transfixed listening to your voice and watching the images. So lovely. I hope everyone enjoyed that as much as I did too. So we move on. I now have to whisk Steve over to the book signing area. So if you can hold any questions off, because there'll be opportunities to see Steve through the rest of today. Can I thank Phil again for his warm introduction for Steve as well? Can we have another round of applause? Thank you, everyone.
As you go back. I'm so glad.